The enigma after the war. At the end of the Second World War, one question refused to die. What really happened to Adolf Hitler? While the Allies cheered the fall of the Third Reich, rumours spread of an escape. Military papers, bank trails, and pre-planned routes hinted that evacuation paths for top officials existed long before Berlin collapsed. Submarine operations, front companies, and deals with neutral states pointed to South America as the final stop for several high-ranking figures. At the center of that web stood Martin Bormann, moving funds, building fronts, and arranging safe havens. Landings on Argentina's coast by U-530 and U-977, and ranches built in remote Patagonia near Bariloche kept investigators busy for decades. Was the bunker the end, or did he vanish into another life? 1942. Power at its peak. In October 1942, Nazi power stretched from the Arctic seas of Norway to the sands of North Africa, and from the French Atlantic to the Volga's banks. In Africa, Erwin Rommel pressed toward the Suez Canal, the British Empire's strategic artery. On the Eastern Front, Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army clawed through Stalingrad street by street. Win Stalingrad and seize Suez, and the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Middle East beckoned, fuel for decades. At sea, the U-boat war hammered Allied lifelines. From bases on the French coast, Karl Donitz's packs stalked convoys, aiming to sever the flow of weapons, fuel, and food. Churchill admitted the submarine threat was the one thing that truly kept him awake. Shark, the Black Pit, an SC-107. Bletchley Park's codebreakers had read the German Navy's Enigma traffic until February 1942. Then the settings changed. The cryptanalysts called the new barrier Shark. For months, Allied escorts lost the edge. In the water, that mattered. At the end of October, convoy SC-107 left New York for Britain. 42 merchant ships guarded by 5 escorts. Their route crossed the mid-Atlantic Black Pit beyond Allied air cover. 13 U-boats formed a kill ring. On the night of November 2nd, 2 submarines pierced the screen. U-402 under Baron Siegfried von Forstner loosed torpedoes from just 400 meters, crippling Empire Sunrise. U-84, commanded by Horst Uphoff, finished the freighter. The same raid saw U-522 under Herbert Schneider destroy 4 more ships. By dawn, 8 merchant vessels were gone, 2 badly damaged. On November 3rd, U-89, commanded by Dietrich Lohmann, slipped into the convoy's center and fired 5 torpedoes, hitting the flagship Jaure loaded with munitions. Moments later, U-32 under Ernst Vogelsang fired into the starboard flank, sinking 3 more ships. One explosion was so violent that submerged submarines felt the shock at 200 feet. U-32 vanished with all hands after the blast. On November 5th, a B-24 Liberator finally located the convoy, drawing naval reinforcements down from Iceland. Under air attack, U-89 took damage and the Wolfpack scattered. The tally was brutal. 15 merchant ships sunk, 4 seriously damaged. Over 100,000 tons in a single action. The Atlantic's arithmetic, November 1942's total losses topped 730,000 tons. For the year, U-boats sank 6.12 million tons, 1,661 ships. The Allies destroyed 87 submarines. Germany built 238 new ones. Donitz's fleet grew from 91 to 212 boats. Every sinking meant fewer tanks, fewer planes, less food reaching Britain. The stakes were simple: keep the convoys or lose the war. Oil, industry, and the money web. Fuel was the Reich's bloodstream. Since the 1930s, Berlin treated oil like ammunition. Without reserves, Germany needed to seize oil-bearing land and guard sea lanes. Hence the drive to the Caucasus and the Mediterranean, and the investment in synthetic fuel plants that turned coal into gasoline. Industry ran on a hard bargain, private giants under state direction. IG Farben, Krupp and others secured enormous contracts, tanks, aircraft, munitions, while leaning on slave labor from concentration camps. In return, they pumped technology, capital and production into the war machine. The profits were extraordinary. Allied bombers aimed to sever these veins. Refineries, armories, and rail hubs went on target lists. Yet in 1942, German output still rose, propped up by forced labor and plunder. Codebreakers pushed back. At Bletchley Park, pressure spiked. Mathematicians, engineers, and early electromechanical machines whittled at Shark. Each decrypted signal saved ships and lives. Progress returned, but in November 1942, the U-boat still owned the night. 2 blows that bent the war. Late October, North Africa flipped. At El Alamein, Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army broke Rommel's line and shoved him toward Libya. Fuel and ammunition bled away. Convoys were pounded from sky and sea. On November 17th, the Afrika Korps began an organized retreat, abandoning equipment and key positions. In Stalingrad, Paulus's army had clawed deep into the city. The Soviets under Georgy Zhukov turned each building into a fortress. Then, mid-November, Operation Uranus slammed shut around more than 250,000 Axis troops. The ring choked off supplies. From East Prussia, Hitler ordered Paulus to hold. Goering promised an airlift of 500 tons per day. The planes delivered a fraction. Men froze and starved by the thousands. Stalingrad was becoming the Reich's first major strategic disaster. Torchlights the West. On November 8th, Operation Torch brought American and British troops ashore in Morocco and Algeria. Axis forces in North Africa were squeezed between Allied armies advancing from both directions. Rommel, ill and exhausted, asked for reinforcements that never arrived. By late December, the Afrika Korps fell back toward Tunisia. Panic behind the walls. In Switzerland, OSS Station Chief Alan Dulles gathered fragments. Diplomats, businessmen, disaffected officers. Some whispered about negotiating a way out. Fear of total defeat had spread inside the regime. Meanwhile, Allied bombers intensified raids on Essen, Hamburg and Kassel, ripping factories and homes. Albert Speer reorganized armaments and increased forced labor to keep output flowing. It worked, but with growing strain. Stalingrad freezes over. By December, the Stalingrad pocket was sealed. Von Manstein's relief force reached within 50 kilometers but couldn't break through. Temperatures plunged to -30, weapons froze, food ran out. Reports of cannibalism surfaced among the encircled. On January 27th, Soviet commanders rejected the last offer of surrender. Days later, Tripoli fell on January 23, 1943. Rommel regrouped in Tunisia. The end came on February 2, 1943. Paulus surrendered. Over 90,000 survivors went into captivity. Tens of thousands lay dead. Hitler, furious, sacked generals and tightened personal control over operations. Bormann's shadow network. As the fronts buckled, Martin Bormann accelerated his quiet moves. Front companies multiplied. Swiss and Spanish bankers opened the right doors. Funds were concealed in secret accounts. Documents were forged. Identities were prepared. Routes were mapped. These steps were taken discreetly, often without informing other party leaders. Contacts with Argentine firms appeared. Crates, documents, gold bars and art moved towards safe ports. The transfers were designed to outlast the war. The timing is the point. Much of this was set in motion before the final collapse. America's weight tips the scale. After Pearl Harbor, US industry surged. By late 1942, American output dwarfed Germany's. Each month, more troops, more tanks, more aircraft crossed the Atlantic to reinforce Britain. The material imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 months that changed everything. In just 3 months, Germany lost North Africa, stalled in the east, and surrendered the initiative to the Allies. Inside the twilight of apparent strength, the regime's managers had already started planning exits, moving assets, arranging identities, and sketching routes toward places where law and money would look the other way. And that is where the escape narrative begins. U-boats that surfaced in Argentina, ranches in remote districts, front companies with familiar directors in faraway capitals. Some of it is proven, some of it is rumor. The difference matters, because the next steps follow the money and the boats, securing the lifeline. As the Reich entered its most critical phase, one priority moved to the top of the list: lock down resources and build escape networks. Martin Bormann drove both. His job wasn't glory at the front, it was control of money, access, logistics, and the quiet routes no one admitted existed. Bormann, the hidden brain. Martin Bormann became the most powerful man behind Hitler, gatekeeper to the Führer and manager of the party's most delicate affairs. Born in 1901, he joined the Nazi Party in 1927. From the start, he stood out. Highly efficient, relentless with details, quietly ambitious. After 1933, his rise was swift. He took charge of the Adolf Hitler Fund for the German economy, a pipeline for voluntary contributions from the Reich's industrial giants, Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben, Daimler-Benz and others. Millions of marks flowed in. Bormann directed those funds into projects that strengthened the party. Residences, propaganda campaigns, and the personal expenses of Hitler's inner circle. In 1936, he became head of the party chancellery. From that office, he built a web of contacts with bankers and businessmen across Europe and opened discreet channels in neutral countries, especially Switzerland. Even Himmler and Goebbels depended on his decisions to get resources. Hitler trusted him completely. That trust let Bormann make strategic calls without supervision, turning him into the Reich's logistical brain, the gatekeeper's power. As the war expanded, Bormann tightened control over confiscated assets across Europe. Gold, jewels, and art were routed to secret depots in Austria and Bavaria. Selected pieces moved through Switzerland and Spain under his watch. These reserves were meant to keep the movement alive, even in defeat. Inside Berlin, Bormann controlled the flow of information to Hitler. He filtered messages and decided who was allowed in the room. For many high-ranking officers, a single word from Bormann could end a career. He oversaw the Führer's Alpine residence at the Berghof and managed financial and personal details down to gifts received. By 1943, his machine ran like a parallel state. He negotiated with Swiss banks for dollars and pounds, hard currencies needed to buy raw materials and technology on neutral markets. Part of that money funded quiet payments and bribes to foreign officials to keep supply routes alive despite Allied pressure. He also oversaw forced labor in armaments plants and mines, feeding profits into the party's central fund while companies reaped lucrative contracts. Bormann stayed out of the spotlight. That was by design. He focused on absolute administrative control. He saw every decree, every military order, every major economic decision. He became the keeper of the Reich's most guarded secrets. Planning exits. From 1943 onward, Bormann became essential to the leadership's survival strategy. He met representatives from neutral countries and traded precious metals for supplies. He evaluated possible refuges in remote parts of South America and in select European regions where secret colonies could be planted. Inside the party, he secured loyalty with rewards, property, cash, and direct access to the Führer. By the end of 1943, his financial and logistical network could function even if the front collapsed. The great loot, art, and culture. From the first invasions, systematic looting was policy. Hitler ordered the cultural riches of every occupied nation sent to the Reich. Thousands of paintings, sculptures, and jewels were seized from museums, galleries, and Jewish homes. In Paris, seizures began within weeks of the 1940 occupation. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, catalogued and packed masterpieces from private collections like the Rothschilds. City by city, Warsaw, Kyiv, Amsterdam, Brussels. Special teams emptied museums and libraries. Rare volumes, medieval manuscripts, and liturgical objects were crated for Berlin. Bormann's administrative network guided many of these operations. Part of the seized art became currency, used to bribe officials or sold on the European black market. Swiss and French dealers moved paintings to private buyers willing to pay in hard cash. Records later showed that between 1941 and 1943, more than 130 trains loaded with cultural objects left Paris. Each carried hundreds of artworks and furnishings, carefully packed and stamped with official seals. In France, the Hôtel Majestic and the Musée Jeu de Paume served as sorting hubs. Rose Valland, a French curator, secretly logged destinations. Her notes were crucial after the war. Still, countless pieces never returned to their owners. In the Netherlands, Flemish masters vanished from museums into German hands. In Poland, the Wawel treasures and Leonardo's lady with an ermine were seized. Many items were moved east for safety, but the real aim was permanent appropriation. In the occupied Soviet territories, Kyiv, Minsk, Smolensk, museums were emptied and shipments sent west before the Red Army could recover them. Loot fed both private collections, Hitler's, Göring's, Bormann's, and the clandestine market that generated cash for the regime. As the Allies advanced in 1944, the Nazis rushed to secure their depots. The Altaussee mine was reinforced. Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer and Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece were stored alongside tapestries, sculptures, and jewels. Additional depots appeared in castles like Herrenchiemsee and in caves across the Bavarian Alps. When Allied troops closed in, some works were destroyed to prevent capture. The logistics were military and precision. Armoured trains, SS-guarded convoys, expert packers, ERR files included photographs and detailed descriptions of each item. Bormann received constant updates on depot status and where the art was headed. The looting of Jewish apartments, the Mobile Action, was especially profitable. In Paris alone, more than 70,000 homes were emptied between 1942 and 1944. Furnishings and valuables were auctioned by compliant dealers. Propaganda framed the theft as a recovery of Germanic art. In reality, Europe's heritage was scattered, destroyed, or hidden. Many families never saw their collections again. Thousands of pieces remain missing. The gold pipeline. From the first conquests, gold was treated as the backbone of Nazi finance. Central banks in occupied countries were priority targets. After the 1938 annexation of Austria, the Reichsbank seized Vienna's reserves at once. The pattern repeated in Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and France. Bullion and coins were melted to erase origin marks, blocking future claims. Belgium lost over 200 tons in days. After Paris fell in 1940, France surrendered more than 800 tons, shipped to Berlin and Vienna. Vaults were emptied. Private deposits, especially those belonging to Jewish families, were seized. Switzerland became the nerve center. The Swiss National Bank and the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, facilitated transfers. Trains carried bullion across the Alps to Swiss vaults, where gold was converted into francs, dollars, or pounds. With hard currency, the Reich paid for raw materials on neutral markets. Spain and Portugal played crucial roles. Through deals with Franco and Salazar, Germany bought tungsten, vital for hardening steel, paying in gold delivered by train and ship under SS Guard. To wipe the trail, looted gold was recast into unmarked bars and spread through banks in Lisbon, Madrid, and Zurich using front companies. Declassified records indicate that from 1939 to 1945, Germany sent gold to Switzerland worth hundreds of millions in today's dollars. Part of that metal came from concentration camps. The SS confiscated jewelry, watches, and even dental gold from prisoners. The SS Economic and Administrative Main Office coordinated with the Reichsbank to melt it down and move it in hidden shipments. The victims' gold ended up in the same accounts that fueled the war and the party's most secret operations. Gold wasn't just a reserve, it was leverage, used to bribe officials, buy weapons, and keep food and oil flowing through neutral markets. Diplomats and bankers were rewarded with bullion to secure cooperation. Hidden ledgers tracked each transfer. When defeat loomed, flows intensified. After Stalingrad and the loss of North Africa, the gold pipeline sped up. In 1943, special convoys moved remaining reserves from Berlin and Vienna to depots in the Bavarian Alps and to Swiss banks. Some trains were disguised as coal shipments to avoid air raids. Spain received part of this gold to reinforce the Bank of Spain's reserves. In exchange, Madrid allowed raw material purchases and free passage to Portugal and South America. Portugal accepted bullion for tungsten and rubber, both essential for arms production. South American connections. By this point, links to South America were real. Front companies in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile received transfers in hard currency converted from Swiss gold. With that money, they bought ranches, factories, and properties, assets that later served as refuges. Declassified files show that between 1943 and 1945, millions of Swiss francs moved into accounts in Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Gold also worked as politics by other means. Secret payments secured silence or collaboration from officials in neutral states. Intermediaries handled transactions via diplomatic pouches and bank transfers. Bullion traveled by cargo plane and at times by submarine on routes protected by the SS. The BIS's role was ambiguous. It processed transfers between central banks even during wartime, a channel Germany used to move looted Belgian and Czechoslovak gold under the guise of routine transactions. By late 1945, large Nazi reserves still sat outside Germany. Estimates suggest Switzerland alone held hundreds of tons. That hoard underwrote escape networks, often labeled Odessa in later accounts, that moved war criminals to South America and the Middle East. Reports claim U-boats carried sealed crates of bullion to Spain and Argentina, extending the pipeline under the waves. Flight of the Eagle, the escape route. As the fronts collapsed, Martin Bormann activated a plan to move leaders and capital out. Reports call it Flight of the Eagle, tied to an operation often referred to as Action Feuerland. He had drafted the outlines by 1942. After Stalingrad and the loss of Africa, it became urgent. The strategy paired escape routes with a massive counterfeiting program, Operation Bernhard. Under Himmler's orders, skilled prisoners produced pound sterling notes of such quality they were nearly undetectable. Those bills circulated on black markets, paying for raw materials, bribes and contacts in neutral hubs. Some of that money, sources claim, fed support networks in South America. Argentina was the key destination. From 1943, Bormann allegedly built ties with the businessman Ludwig Freude, who had access to Juan Domingo Perón. Through that channel, agreements were said to guarantee refuge for arrivals who brought capital, technology, or sensitive information. Ranch purchases in Patagonia and projects around Bariloche fit into that plan. Transit routes ran by sea from northern Spain and the French coast. Submarines, cited in some files as U-530 and U-233, were reportedly outfitted to carry documents, cash, and valuables to Mar del Plata. Counterfeiting extended to US dollars, used in Lisbon and Istanbul, to secure passage on neutral ships and to pay middlemen. Mobile presses produced forged Latin American passports and nationality papers, smoothing travel. To anchor logistics in the Americas, investments in Argentina and Paraguay moved through companies importing machinery and chemicals, legitimate on paper, cover in practice. Chile and Brazil were added. German colonies in southern Chile, Valdivia, Osorno, offered a safe environment. In Brazil, a few firms managed to place funds in Sao Paulo and Rio despite Allied pressure. Extracting key personnel was the most delicate task. Priority went to SS leaders, scientists, and technicians. Routes combined flights to Spain, sailings on neutral ships with African stopovers, and rendezvous with submarines bound for South America. Names in some accounts include Luftwaffe ace Hans Ulrich Rudel, conducting reconnaissance to validate itineraries. Coordination stayed with a small inner circle, using codes and encrypted messages routed through embassies in neutral countries. After the Normandy landings in 1944, Flight of the Eagle moved into full operation. Submarines left Kiel and Hamburg with strategic cargo. Engineers in Buenos Aires prepared improvised airstrips for emergencies. Every run needed forged papers, cooperative customs officers, and precisely calculated bribes. Operation Bernhard cash was reportedly stockpiled in Argentina and Uruguay for payoffs, property purchases, and industrial fronts. Many investments materialized in agriculture and shipping. The architecture was in place. The clock was ticking. Operation Hunt for Leaders. As the Allies advanced, London and Washington built teams to seize archives, technology, and personnel. Specialized units operated behind the lines. One of the most notable was 30 Commando, built to grab sensitive documents before they could be destroyed. Ian Fleming, then a British naval intelligence officer, and later the creator of a certain fictional spy, helped conceive it. These raiders hit newly liberated towns, pulling party files, cipher books, and prototypes. They tracked SS and Gestapo rosters to follow high-value targets. The haul included maps, bank records, arms inventories, and data on secret experiments. Inside Germany, chaos widened. Officers torched evidence or fled toward Bavaria, Austria, and northern Italy. Lines of refuge ran through monasteries, farms, and sympathetic homes. Uniforms were swapped for civilian clothes. Forged documents appeared. The Allies understood speed mattered. Commandos rode with frontline troops to secure files at the moment of retreat. After D-Day, depots in Normandy yielded files on Nazi networks in Latin America and neutral capitals. By late 1944, the OSS sent agents to Switzerland and Spain to trace the party's money channels. Intercepts pointed to transfers of cash and bullion into Swiss banks. In Bern, Alan Dulles spoke with figures close to the regime, some seeking safety in exchange for information. Inside Germany, opposition gained a faint pulse. Some Wehrmacht officers tested contacts with the Allies. The Gestapo and SS kept a hard lid on dissent. Bormann tightened the leadership's security. Tunnels, bunkers, and evacuation corridors linked Berlin to Bavaria and Austria. With France liberated, pressure on top officials spiked. In Paris, Allies captured Gestapo and Abwehr files outlining networks in Europe and Latin America. Lists surfaced of ships sailing from Marseille and Bordeaux with suspicious cargoes. Progress through Belgium and the Netherlands uncovered more. British T-Force commandos seized weapons plants and Luftwaffe offices to keep technology from Soviet hands. Caches of gold, art, and encrypted documents appeared. Arrests of officers like Hermann Fegelein and Karl Wolff yielded details on routes and convoys prepared for Switzerland. Submarine movements toward the South Atlantic kept attention fixed on possible maritime escapes. The OSS and MI6 followed ratlines, fugitive routes supported by sympathizers, with help from certain clerics and neutral officials. From Italian ports, ships sailed for Latin America, carrying wanted men and valuables. In Rome, contacts linked to the Vatican facilitated Red Cross papers for former SS officers. The threads ran into Spain, Portugal, and North Africa before crossing the ocean. Intercepted messages mentioned gold and false identities. The network was too large to close completely. With the war ending, the hunt went global. Simon Wiesenthal and Jewish organizations began tracking war criminals. Blacklists spread through Allied stations. Meanwhile, clandestine groups often labeled Odessa moved resources to keep fugitives ahead of the net, from the bunker to the sky. By late April 1945, Berlin was sealed. Soviet forces closed from the east. Allied units pressed from the west. In the Führerbunker, Hitler and his circle saw the end coming. Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief, ran the final moves, evacuating sensitive archives and planning escape paths. In tunnels connecting the Chancellery to shelters and the subway, reports say they stacked documents, gold bullion and counterfeit notes from Operation Bernhard. Communication was nearly dead, but Bormann reportedly maintained contact with officers in northern Germany to coordinate flights and ground convoys south. Hitler's health had visibly worsened, tremors, flashes of rage. According to accounts, Müller drew up a plan using body doubles trained to mirror Hitler and Eva Braun. The goal? Stage a convincing scene in the Chancellery garden, confuse the Soviets, and buy time. On April 30th, as artillery hammered the city centre, the simulation began. 2 bodies were prepared and burned in the courtyard. Witnesses like Otto Günscher and Heinz Linger later said they saw the flames, but the remains were fragments, hard to prove, easy to doubt. While that scene played out, Hitler and Eva, reports claim, changed into civilian clothes and took forged papers marking them as low-ranking staff. They moved through tunnels to an improvised strip on Berlin's outskirts. There, a Junkers Ju-52 from the clandestine KG-200 unit waited. The takeoff, according to declassified notes, was supervised by Bormann. Meanwhile, Müller erased tracks in the bunker, burning files on financial flows and escape routes and sending bogus radio traffic to muddy Allied intercepts. When the Soviets seized the Chancellery, they found contradictions that fed doubt. The flight path swung north to refuel, accounts placed the stop at Travemünde, then angled towards southern Europe, skirting Allied control. A second landing reportedly took place at a Spanish strip near Reus, with help from Franco-aligned agents. From there, the Ju-52 continued to the Canary Islands, where submarines linked to a Seawolf operation were said to be waiting with cargo space and long-range plans. Allied reports noted unusual U-boat activity around the islands in May 1945, enough to keep suspicions live. KG-200 crews knew the clandestine routes and used false codes to slip through. As Berlin fell, the Soviets announced Hitler's death in the bunker. The lack of verifiable remains kept investigators busy. Prisoners claimed sightings in armoured convoys. Others mentioned flights to Spain. In the weeks after, UB-530 and U-977 arrived in Argentina months apart, fueling speculation that high-value passengers had moved via sea. Argentine files mention communications between German officers and local officials about receiving special cargo. Bormann and Müller, by these same accounts, continued shuttling funds towards Switzerland and Spain, moving gold and currencies by train to Austrian mines and depots. The Canary Islands handoff remains a contested chapter. Some sources point to a ship headed west, others to a direct transfer into a U-boat built to carry passengers and valuables. Soviet witnesses described charred bodies in Berlin too damaged to confirm identities. Later claims argued that dental fragments did not match records, arguments that reinforced escape theories but remained disputed. Officially, the Allies accepted the bunker death. Unofficially, they kept digging. Ghost submarines in the South Atlantic. On July 10, 1945, the naval base at Mar del Plata was surprised by the arrival of U-530. The crew surrendered without resistance. The full contents were never publicly disclosed. On August 17th, U-977 reached the same base after a voyage of more than 100 days. The back-to-back arrivals ignited rumours. Had Nazi leaders and cargo been offloaded along the coast before the formal surrender? Maritime police reports referenced night landings near Necochea and Puerto Madryn, boats unloading metal crates and civilians. Witnesses spoke of trucks carrying those crates to ranches run by sympathizers in Patagonia. Proposed routes to South America were meticulous. From Europe, stops in Galicia or Cadiz for resupply, onto the Canaries, then into the South Atlantic, running deep and slow to avoid detection, 8 to 10 weeks at sea, depending on evasive maneuvers. Reception in Argentina was said to be handled by German businessmen, most notably Ludwig Freude, who had direct access to Perón's circle. Freude reportedly supervised shipments to depots near Mar del Plata, including properties like Moromar, and brokered strategic purchases around Bariloche and Villa La Angostura. German colonies in Patagonia played their part, established transport links, contacts with authorities, and a culture of discretion. Hotels and social clubs doubled as meeting points. The Allies pushed for answers. FBI and US naval intelligence reports tracked submarine and merchant movements into the South Atlantic. Declassified notes suggest some U-boats carried more than money, parts for V-2 rockets and jet blueprints said to be destined for engineers already in Argentina. U-977's story remained particularly opaque. Its commander, Heinz Schaffer, claimed they stayed submerged more than 60 days using a snorkel. Dangerous, but effective. He never confirmed whether they made landings before surrendering, which kept suspicions alive. The press called them ghost submarines. The theory spread. High-ranking fugitives rode those routes. Allied pressure mounted on Buenos Aires, but gaps in evidence kept the story in the dark. The networks in Argentina had been running before the war ended. Import-export firms acted as fronts to move money and materials. Ties to Swiss and Spanish banks greased transfers into Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Funds paid for bribes and the building of refuges in remote areas. Freude and his circle handled arrivals, distribution, and the relocation of former officers into the interior. Bariloche and Villa La Angostura emerged as strategic nodes, mountains for cover and self-sufficient communities for support. FBI reporting floated a possibility. Some submarines unloaded cargo on deserted beaches, which would explain why valuable items weren't present at surrender. Metal crates, gold, documents, art, could have gone inland before the U-boats showed their flags. Merchant ships under neutral colors picked up cargo in the Canaries or Spanish ports and carried it forward as legal goods. The mix of methods buried the trail. The U-boat chapter cemented an idea. The South Atlantic had become the last viable Nazi escape corridor. Safe havens in Patagonia, Inalco and beyond. After the war, Argentina became a primary destination for fugitives. Among the safe zones mapped by Bormann's network, Bariloche and the shores of Lake Nahuel Huapi stand out. According to some researchers, by mid-1947, Hitler and Eva Braun reached the Inalco estate, a secluded residence positioned for maximum isolation. Inalco is credited to architect Alejandro Bustillo, a leading figure in Patagonian design. The property reportedly had a private dock, a seaplane hangar, and thick woods screening it from view. Speedboats connected Inalco with Villa La Angostura and other points around the lake. Testimonies gathered over the years describe a small security team of trusted Germans, former SS and local allies. The estate was said to have generators, shortwave radios, and underground stores for provisions and documents. Supplies came through German businessmen in Buenos Aires and Bariloche. The operation's quiet efficiency helped it pass unnoticed. Bariloche itself became a hub for fugitives. Names like Josef Mengele and Erich Priebke appear in accounts of the time, blending into social clubs and German-owned businesses. Club Andino Bariloche, founded before the war, became a meet-up point where German conversation drew little attention. Life at Inalco, as described in some reports, ran on strict security. Visitors were screened. Former naval and Luftwaffe officers said to have reached Argentina by sea met there for confidential talks. Finance, Swiss accounts, and links in Paraguay and Brazil, all built on Bormann's pre-war architecture. Eva Braun kept a low profile. Neighbors claimed she used aliases and dressed simply, passing as the spouse of a businessman. The German-run shops and hotels provided cover. Foreign faces didn't stand out. From 1947 to 1955, Inalco was described as an operations center for the southern network, money movements, routes for new arrivals, and conversations with the Argentine government. Perón and Eva Duarte, accounts suggest, maintained an ambiguous posture, protection and documents in exchange for technology and funds. The terrain did the rest. Dense forests, deep lakes and winter mountains offered a natural shield. Local accounts mention armed patrols near Inalco's roads. Others describe small planes touching the lake and boats unloading crates at night. Over time, a routine settled. Early walks in the garden, briefings with security, health troubles. By the 1950s, reports say Hitler's condition worsened, cardiovascular strain and a return of tremors. A German physician, named in some sources as Dr. Otto Lehmann, made quiet visits to supervise treatment. The network grew. New fugitives arrived in San Carlos de Bariloche, Villa Traful, and Villa La Angostura. Some found work on infrastructure projects. Others built hotels and tourism businesses. The flow of European immigrants helped the couple's presence blur into the landscape. Inalco wasn't the only hideout. Other properties around Bariloche and rural Patagonia served as safe houses. Several, it's said, had hidden passages and underground rooms stocked with supplies and papers. Escape paths to Chile over mountain passes were part of the contingency plan. A controversial ending. In 1955, Perón fell. The climate changed. Investigations into war criminals intensified. Several figures were named in the press. According to reports, Hitler and Eva moved to even more remote properties. Money shifted to banks in Montevideo and Santiago. Rumours multiplied. Someone claimed to see him downtown in Bariloche wearing a hat and dark glasses. Another said a boat on Nahuel Huapi carried him with armed guards. No verified photographs surfaced, but researchers gathered testimonies suggesting certain circles knew. By the late 1950s, health again worsened. The doctor visited more often. Medicines arrived from Europe. Eva took a larger role managing the estate and supply lines. Life narrowed to quiet routines and avoidance. According to the book Grey Wolf, Hitler died on February 13, 1962, at Inalco. The claim says he was buried in secret somewhere in Patagonia, perhaps on the estate grounds. Eva is said to have remained in Argentina for a time, then slipped from the record. This remains a controversial theory. It relies on testimonies from people who said they were present in his final days, but it has not been universally accepted by historians. The 1960s brought more hunters. Simon Wiesenthal and others followed leads around Bariloche without conclusive proof. Declassified FBI files mention possible sightings in the region. Inalco, with its private dock and restricted access, became a symbol of the hidden life. Even today, stories of tunnels and secret rooms compete with official denials. The 1962 death narrative is reinforced in some accounts by former employees who describe a quiet, nighttime burial attended by a small group of Germans. Taken together, these versions suggest he spent more than a decade in Argentina, protected by isolated estates, local networks, and money moved years before Berlin fell. They remain, however, unverified claims. Reports suggest, files hint, witnesses remember, the records are fragmentary, and that is why this story still lives, somewhere between what can be proved and what people say they saw.